Today on our podcast, we have part 2 in our story, Screenwriting with Walt. The late 1940s and the early 1950s were a time of transition for Walt Disney Productions as the studio slowly evolved from one focused on animation to one focused on live action, then TV, then an amusement park. The story of Larry Watkin, who was the main screenwriter at the Disney studio, is one that follows many of these changes, as Disney begins to create films that will compete head-to-head with live-action titles released by Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount. In our last episode, we looked at Watkin's early work on the Darby O'Gill stories, and in this episode, we will look at a key Disney feature, Treasure Island. Disney would make more spectacular live-action films later in the 1950s and early 1960s, but Treasure Island was the film that first moved Walt and the studio in this direction. It's a story about how Walt reimagines what his studio is and will become. But before I get to our story, I would like to thank another round of recent Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so these are the people who keep this whole show going. I am deeply grateful to each and every person who supports us over on Bandcamp, but today, gratitude is going out to Bagel Batman, Lynn, Melissa, and Mark. Thanks to each of you for signing up and supporting this show. And now let's move on to part 2 of Screenwriting with Walt, an episode that is mostly focused on the making of Treasure Island. Treasure Island marked Disney's entry into live-action features. In the late 1940s, Disney experimented with live-action with Song of the South and So Dear to My Heart, but each of these features had substantial sections of animation, which helped sell the film at the box office as a Disney picture. Though Disney did consider creating an animated film in England using British animators to spend down the company's impounded UK funds, Walt's attention quickly turned to live action as the most efficient way to accomplish this. Treasure Island was a project that Walt had considered for years. Throughout his life, he was drawn to classic novels and traditional stories. But in the late 1940s, MGM had reserved the right to create the next feature based on the Robert Louis Stevenson novel. MGM owned the rights, Walt said, but I made a deal with them on something else and got it. Treasure Island would be filmed far from the Burbank studio and far from Walt's oversight, yet it was a project that at least initially he thought would be relatively easy to complete. Shortly before filming began, he naively predicted, the live-action features are a cinch, comparatively speaking. The production framework for Treasure Island called for a few Americans from the Disney studio to work alongside a crew that was almost entirely British. This created a situation in which a few Americans, among them producer Perce Pierce, director Byron Haskin, and writer Larry Watkin, oversaw what was largely a UK production. As production became a reality, Walt's initial impression of how easy it would be to create a live-action feature changed somewhat. It was quite a job to get the momentum going, he said. But the work was necessary. 3 years after the war, the UK created the Wilson-Johnson Film Agreement to spur its economy and to encourage local film production. For American studios, the act specified that money collected from the presentation of their films in the UK now needed to be spent in the UK. Both Disney and its distributor had hundreds of thousands of pounds trapped in British accounts. As Treasure Island was a joint Disney-RKO project, it would allow both companies to spend down their impounded assets creating a film in the UK that then could be shown elsewhere to produce money that then could be deposited into Disney's and RKO's American bank accounts. thereby turning blocked funds into open profits. The sense of struggle was shared by many who worked on this unusual project, essentially a live-action film produced by a mid-size animation studio housed in California, with shooting locations arranged in England. "It was a hell of a job," director Byron Haskin said. Haskin understood Disney's financial situation with the impounded accounts, but he also understood the larger financial picture of the studio. As the film went into production in 1949, Disney needed to pay back a pile of debt it had accumulated during the war. Recent pictures such as So Dear to My Heart, Song of the South, and Melody Time hadn't been big money makers. In 1949, which included the period when Disney released So Dear to My Heart, the company showed a net loss of $93,000. Disney's previous plan to use live action mixed with animation was simply not bringing in enough money. The animation proved too expensive, and the public viewed these films as existing in a different category than Disney classics such as Snow White and Pinocchio. Beyond this, Walt recognized that the direction of his studio, in fact of most animation studios, was beginning to change. For decades, Disney had supported itself by releasing cartoon shorts every 2 to 3 weeks. But by 1949, the production cost of cartoons was becoming too expensive to be a financial center point for the studio's future. At this point in Walt's career, Haskin said, the Mickey Mouse shorts had begun to cost too much, up to $78,000 for a half-reel. Terribly expensive stuff. Walt himself was direct about his motivation to create Treasure Island. "I wanted to diversify as much as I could," he said. For Walt, diversifying meant not only live-action features, but nature documentaries and soon TV programs and eventually an amusement park. Walt understood that his career was at a turning point. Behind him were nearly 3 decades, where he'd focused almost solely on animation, and in front of him were new projects and the hope of turning a modest-sized animation studio into something much larger. With Watkin's script, Treasure Island would be a unique Disney film, one arranged for both a family and a general audience. It didn't shy away from violence. Multiple pirates are shot in the face, including one shot by the 12-year-old child lead of the film. This type of violence would quickly be removed from Disney movies made in later decades, but that's not how Walt began his journey into live action. Haskin believed that he had been selected to direct Treasure Island because his last picture had been a crime noir, the story of criminals and stolen money. Walt equated Treasure Island with a kind of gangster movie, he said. By some quirk of fate, he'd recently seen my film, Too Late for Tears. He liked the action and the gangsters. Walt said, that's the kind of stuff we need for Treasure Island. The impression that Treasure Island would be framed as a unique type of gangster film was further solidified when Walt hired Bob Newton as the adult lead for the role of Long John Silver, an actor whose last film, Odd Man Out, had also been a crime drama. With this, Haskin saw his role, in terms of creating a narrative emphasis, was to transform Treasure Island into a film with overtones of a crime noir in which the pirates were essentially gangsters with long hair and earrings from the 18th century. Though major roles were cast by the studio, Haskin and producer Perce Pierce needed to fill out secondary roles and a range of dress extras on their own, identifying British actors who could play pirates, sailors, and townfolk. For this, the two men traveled to England in May 1949. For just under a week, they sailed together on the Queen Mary, somewhat of an odd couple, setting out to make Disney's first live-action feature overseas. Pierce insisted on wearing casual clothes, particularly a wide-brimmed felt hat that immediately identified him as an American. And Haskin traveled most everywhere with his cat. As one Hollywood reporter noted, he had a clause in his contract to take along his Manx cat on any location trips. The cat's name was Herman, a small striped animal that was often Haskin's companion both on the ship and in his hotel room in London. Perce Pierce and I saw 18 stage plays and 18 nights for casting purposes, Haskin said. There were 32 speaking parts in the script. Decisions were made quickly, with tentative offers given to actors or their agents, often within a day of their stage performance. One reporter would put it this way: the very first actor that Perce Pierce and director Byron Haskin saw on a London stage won a featured role in the Technicolor production. That actor, John Gregson, would play the sailor Tom Redruth, whom the pirates eventually kill on the island. Night after night, Haskin and Pierce went to the theater. The job of filling out minor roles should have largely fallen to Pierce as producer, but Haskin saw even then that Pierce was anxious in this new role. Pierce was there primarily to ensure that Walt's wishes, as best he understood them, shaped the film as it was produced in England. Once Haskin understood this, he realized that he needed to help Pierce embody his role as producer. The world of animation, he suggested, had very different social traditions compared to the world of live action. One of Haskin's first acts in mentoring him was to insist that Pierce dress better and to lose the comical felt hat. We'd get dressed in dinner jackets to go to the theater, then Pierce would slap on the old brown hat. One night leaving the Savoy, I said, "For God's sakes, Perce, leave that lousy hat at home." For a while, Haskin was able to shame Pierce into buying a new hat and wearing it when they went out, one that had an air of sophistication. But this only lasted until Walt visited the set, at which time Pierce put on his old, deeply worn felt hat. With Walt there, Haskin understood that this was Pierce's true role at the studio, one for which he was rewarded, that of the befuddled Midwesterner. It was a role Pierce was smart enough to know was appreciated by Walt. Much of the film was shot at Denham Studios, a lot that contained a lagoon and tropical areas. It was an ideal situation for the production, a lot that included shooting locations for everything from a small British village to tropical areas that could be dressed as a Caribbean island. Sound stages were dressed with sets that represented the ship, the Hispaniola, both interior areas and the main deck, as well as various interiors such as the Admiral Benbow Inn, which was the home of Jim Hawkins before he set off for Treasure Island. Walt visited the set for only a single day as part of a working vacation in the UK, then left with his family to tour the country. Before he left, Haskin observed Pierce have one final conversation with Walt. "I want every address you'll be at on the continent," Pierce requested, "so that when the trouble starts, I can get in touch with you." Haskin saw this for what it was, an indication that Pierce would be of minimal help with a production that was shooting thousands of miles from the Disney studio. If Haskin didn't think much of Pierce, he respected Larry Watkin and the work he had done on the script. The novel Treasure Island was a book that Haskin had known as a boy. He also knew that its author, Robert Louis Stevenson, likely had little idea how to effectively describe a large sailing ship which was central to the picture. The novelist, Haskin said, never knew what kind of ship he was writing about. It took a whole crew of pirates to sail it out to the island. Then, for the sake of convenience, he had the boy sail it around the island for days. As with many other narrative issues, Watkin had focused the script details on realistic efforts on sea and on land. In terms of issues of sailing a large ship, Watkin, Haskin explained, took care of that inconsistency. The first significant problem that the production team faced concerned the young American actor Bobby Driscoll, a problem that no one could have predicted. He arrived in England on June 21, 1949, largely to rehearse and prepare for his role. At the time, Driscoll was 12 years old, technically too young to work on a film in England. England required work permits for children, though they would only grant them to those at least 14 years old. The problem was simple. If the production company applied for a work permit, they would be denied one, but the application process would place Driscoll on the authorities' radar. Instead, Driscoll, with his parents, entered the country on a 3-month tourist visa, as technically his employment was with the Disney and RKO companies, both housed in the States. Even at this time, Driscoll and his family likely planned to stay longer than 3 months, as shooting would continue into fall. The production team assumed that this legal breach, a minor technicality, would be overlooked by authorities, especially as Disney had freely revealed that Driscoll, a child actor from America, was coming to England to work on the film, a story that had been picked up in dozens of British papers. No one on the Disney team was trying to conceal this fact, nor did anyone believe it would create a problem. Likely in June, Driscoll traveled to Denham Studios, not far from London, where he prepared for work on the film, while second unit work began southwest of the city. Location manager Russell Lloyd took in scenes along the rocky coast of Hartland Key. These were a series of establishing and atmospheric shots for the early sections of the film. The scenes were all shot outdoors, waves crashing on rocks, wind moving along cliffs, a small stone building against the darkening sky. Russell Lloyd also spent weeks filming the ship, the Hispaniola, as it moved through the River Fall, the Helford River, and Falmouth Harbor. Locals recalled seeing an image so unusual it could only belong to the movies. A ship so strangely rigged that it might have sailed out of a storybook, one local noted, carrying a roistering band of cutthroat brigands. The vessel was actually a diesel schooner owned by a shipping line that was propped and dressed to look like an 18th century ship. Likewise, the pirates on its deck weren't professional actors, they were locals in costume. Both adults and an 11-year-old boy, Ian Martin. Martin had been vacationing with his family near Falmouth Harbor when the crew spotted him. He would serve as a quick stand-in for Bobby Driscoll, as Driscoll remained at the Denham Studios. Months later, the use of this stand-in would create an interesting precedent in terms of how later sections of the film would be shot. While the second unit took in their shots 200 miles away just outside London, Byron Haskin was preparing actors for their roles. Among the largest challenges was preparing Bob Newton to act with one leg tied up, so he could appear as the one-legged pirate Long John Silver. Most shots would present him from the waist up, but many shots required him to walk on one leg. "Newton's taken so many falls practicing with a crutch," one person noted. "He says he feels like Humpty Dumpty." As rehearsals continued, Haskin realized that Newton would need to have his leg tied up for most of the movie, even when his legs weren't on screen, as his gait was noticeably different when he hobbled with one leg and a cane than when he tried to imitate this movement while standing on 2 legs. Another problem was that the film's child lead, Bobby Driscoll, needed a little coaching as to how to manage emotional turns central to the story. One afternoon, while rehearsing a scene, Driscoll said, "I can't understand why Long John and I are such friends at this point, and then later I'm acting like I hate him." Haskin then walked the boy through the entire story, emphasizing how various plot points changed his character's outlook and also redefined the mood on the ship. That night, Haskin explained, Bobby rushed home and read the whole script over again in a very different light. But the largest problem, somewhat surprisingly, remained Driscoll's legal status as a minor working in England. Many on the Denham Studios lot knew of the unique legal position of Driscoll. He was too young to obtain a work permit in England, though similar rules had been finessed on other films without much notice. All went smoothly up until September, shortly after first unit production began. About 2 weeks into filming, a prop man was fired from the set. The disgruntled worker then told authorities out of spite that an American was working on the picture without a permit. Though authorities likely intended to take a live and let live attitude to Driscoll's work, once a report was filed, they were obligated to follow up on it. Authorities quickly confirmed that Driscoll was not only an American, but also too young to work on any film in the UK. During the fourth week of September, Driscoll, his parents, and representatives from Disney were ordered to appear in court where officials accused Bobby of intentionally working without a permit, even though, had he applied, he would have been denied one due to his age. His father, Cletus Driscoll, along with RKO and the Disney Company, were charged with aiding and abetting. All three parties pleaded not guilty, but as it was clear that Driscoll had been working on the film, they were found guilty. Before leaving court, S.E. Seaton, the counsel for Disney and the Driscolls, requested 6 weeks to prepare an appeal with a full defense. But to create this defense, they needed to be in possession of certain official documents not yet received from America. Their defense had two parts. First, Driscoll, as he was employed by Disney, wasn't technically employed by an entity in the UK. Specifically, Seaton explained, "Our contention is that this boy was, is, and always had been employed by the American corporation." And second, that the larger Disney RKO arrangement was supported by an overall aim to abide by British law and support the British economy. About this, Seaton added, by producing Treasure Island in England instead of elsewhere, Mr. Walt Disney acted with the encouragement of the British government as expressed in the Wilson-Johnson Film Agreement of 1948. He has put several hundreds of thousands of pounds of idle sterling into circulation in Britain and has provided employment for many hundreds of British film workers who otherwise might be unemployed at this critical time. Along with this, Seaton explained that Disney had never tried to hide the fact that Driscoll, while employed by an American company, would be acting in England. Disney, in various interviews and press releases, had promoted this fact in local papers to help develop interest in the film. "We contrived a defense that he wasn't subject to British child labor laws," Byron Haskin recalled. With this, the judge agreed to give the Disney team 6 weeks to arrange their defense. But Disney used that time to film every key scene that included Driscoll. "We grabbed him and threw him on the stage," Haskin said. "I had to shoot little Jim Hawkins out of that picture in 6 weeks, doing close-ups with all the other actors present for background or offstage voices." Most people on set were amazed with Driscoll's acting ability. Even though he was only 12, he was able to embody the part. "The kid put on no airs at all," Haskin said. "He had a great sense of the mechanics of screen movement." When those 6 weeks were up, S.E. Seaton took Bobby Driscoll and his parents back to court, where a judge ordered him back to America. Each of the three parties, Bobby Driscoll, his parents, and the Disney-managed production company, were fined £100, which was roughly the equivalent of $280. Once Driscoll was gone, the main production team followed the lead of the second unit crew. They too used a British boy with a British work permit as a double for the remaining shots. He was positioned far from the camera in place of Bobby Driscoll, which worked well enough for the remaining shots. Haskin felt, however, he was starting the picture over. The shots with Bobby Driscoll had a slightly different emotional texture than those with the double. In the weeks that remained, the crew focused on the scenes with the adult actors. Nearly all of the cast were stage actors, accustomed to interacting with others on stage. Filming now required these same actors to pretend at times they were speaking to Bobby Driscoll. Again, Haskin could see the difference in the quality of their performance. The actors needed to be coached into a space where the environment felt as emotionally charged as it was when Driscoll had been with them. Now that Driscoll was gone, Bob Newton, who played Long John Silver, became far more the emotional center of the film. His scenes, unlike Driscoll's, which needed to be rushed, could be shot and reshot until his performance radiated charm and menace. He was exactly what Walt wanted, a villain who projected both danger and warmth, a complex character focused on stealing buckets of gold coins and jewels, while at the same time acting as a willing mentor and protector to young Jim Hawkins. Long John Silver was a complex role, Haskin said. All of the early scenes with the little boy were like father and son. They were tender, sensitive scenes. In rehearsals, I would just drool. Newton, who had a history with alcohol, a temptation he was trying to manage, at times would freeze in front of the cameras. He was conscious that this role was, in ways, an opportunity to advance his career. Without the camera, he could fully embody the role in a way that everyone found mesmerizing. Well, I tried to trick him, Haskin said. I would start the camera unbeknownst to him and walk in and say, "All right, let's rehearse this thing." With this, he was able to include some of Newton's full genius, but the director remained aware that with the camera on, Newton, though still captivating, was acting slightly beneath his full ability, hoping perhaps for a more measured respectability on screen. Considering that this was Disney's first live-action film, also a film shot overseas, production went reasonably well, even though Driscoll was deported. A second round of problems, however, emerged shortly after production wrapped. Larry Watkin and Byron Haskin returned to America while Perce Pierce and a British editor, Alan Jaggs, worked on a cut of the film. As Treasure Island was Pierce's first time as a live-action producer, it was also his first time to oversee the edits. Disney animated films on which Pierce had previously worked were largely pre-edited in the story development stage, ensuring the studio didn't waste money animating unneeded sequences, whereas live-action films were typically edited in post-production, with the producer or director giving the story its final shape in an editing bay. A typical live-action production had reels of additional footage, scenes from which an editor could assemble the story. According to Haskin, Pierce had absolutely no skill in taking raw footage and aligning it around a traditional plot to engage an audience. Pierce made his original edits in England, sending only his cut and some, but not all, of the additional footage back to Burbank. Honestly, I never saw a worse massacre in all my life, Haskin said. Walt saw the rough cut, understood the problems. Instead of sending it back to Pierce, Walt called in Haskin, who was then in Los Angeles, and showed him the film in a screening room. It was a mess, a choppy film without a deep sense of suspense or elegance. Once it was over, as the lights came back up, Walt turned to him. "How about taking over and recutting it?" Haskin agreed, but by this point, he had also learned who, at the Disney studio, had a strong sense of story. "I took Larry Watkin," Haskin continued, "and a copy of the script into a cutting room with the picture. There, they unglued the edits and inserted more footage to create a gradual and compelling sense of narrative escalation, as Bobby Driscoll's character slowly understands that he's trapped on a ship with pirates who intend to take it over by force. For some sequences, it was difficult to create a strong sense of continuity, as Driscoll had been absent for some shots. Editing a visual story, Watkin discovered, was different than editing a script or a novel. The film, through its images, needed to convey the felt sense that the actors were all together and that deep, troubling emotions moved between them. This was a different type of art than writing. As Watkin and Haskin were editing the film in California, and as some of the raw footage remained in England, they didn't have access to everything they desired, but they were able to tell a far more compelling story than the version overseen by Pierce. "Laboriously, we put it back together the way it was written and shot," Haskin continued, "lacking a few desired shots and giving it a kind of staccato effect here and there, but at least it told the story straight." Together, Haskin and Watkin created a film focused on the boy, but one that capitalized on Bob Newton's excellent performance as Long John Silver. They both saw that the camera loved Newton. He was electric on screen, even if he held back a little once the cameras were switched on. As Newton had been on the set the entire time, it was likely easier to edit around his scenes than it was around those with Driscoll. Over a series of days, Watkin threw himself into the task, creating a film that functioned in some ways like a novel, in which the selection and arrangement of scenes not only created strong flow, but also allowed the audience to understand the interior motivation of each character. Watkin was terrific, Haskin said. He had a flair for the period stuff. Editing for story was yet another way that Watkin demonstrated to Walt that he not only understood his vision for live action, but knew how to adapt his skills as a storyteller so that that vision appeared on screen. The final cut was close to Walt's original vision, something akin to a gangster story about a heist, dressed up as a period drama with pirates, with a young star and a deeply charismatic villain. Treasure Island proved to be a critical success. The New York Times, which could run hot and cold on Disney films, said, "Treasure Island is simply fascinating. Mr. Stevenson's classic never really sprung to full cinematic life until Mr. Disney waved his magic wand." The film was also a financial success, bringing in $4.8 million against $1.8 million in negative costs. Most importantly, the production of this film depleted Disney's impounded funds, but the film proved so profitable that both Disney and RKO were interested in co-producing other British-made dramas. The person who received the most praise for the film was Bob Newton, a 45-year-old actor who, due to hard living, appeared far older than his age. The film was so successful that Newton was immediately cast in another RKO feature where he played Blackbeard the pirate. Following that, an Australian production company hired him to star in a film and TV series called The Adventures of Long John Silver, a project technically unrelated to the Disney effort, but as the novel was in public domain, its characters could be used for new productions without copyright concerns. The Adventures of Long John Silver was aired in America and in the UK in 1955. It was Newton's last performance as a lead. The following year he passed away at the age of 50. His role in the Disney picture was the high point of his later career. Treasure Island established a team of artists that would in large part comprise a second production unit for the Disney studio through the 1950s, one primarily focused on historical dramas. Watkin, of course, would be part of this team, as would Perce Pierce, now that he had a little experience as a producer. Joining them would be individuals like composer Clifton Parker and matte painter Peter Allen Shaw. The British production also allowed Disney to hire talented English technicians wishing to make stronger connections with Hollywood, such as cinematographer Freddie Young, who would later shoot Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia. George Harding Foster, another writer who briefly worked at the Disney studio in the early 1950s, looked at Disney's special overseas unit with admiration. There are only about 10 Disney employees connected with the overseas pictures, Foster said. Larry Watkin and a fellow named Perce Pierce work as a team to make the feature films abroad. They get a company together in England, shoot the film, and bring it back here for final editing. Disney will take a month or two abroad to check up on them, but actually has little to do with any but the broadest aspects of these pictures. Perhaps most significantly, Treasure Island demonstrated that Disney could be successful with films that contained no animation. Along with this, the film also demonstrated that Walt was able to successfully move his company in new directions, even if this first effort had a few missteps along the way. After Treasure Island, Walt told Larry Watkin to look for another story that could be filmed in either England or Ireland, preferably Ireland. Watkin wanted to return to the Darby O'Gill material, but he knew that was not possible. The picture everyone understood would be expensive, and before filming could begin, Disney needed to have financing in place or have more money in its own bank accounts. Beyond the money problems, Disney still had Bobby Driscoll under contract. One of Walt's immediate concerns was finding a new role for Driscoll, ideally in a UK picture, but of course only after the boy turned 14. Watkin looked for a novel, short story, or stage play with a role for a 13 or 14-year-old boy, a story that would also interest an older audience, much in the fashion of Treasure Island. Ultimately, the studio was unable to find a suitable project for Driscoll, which meant that Driscoll was loaned out to other studios until Disney needed him. Disney used him as the voice of Goofy's son Jr. in a couple of cartoon shorts. Most notably, though, Disney cast him as the voice of Peter Pan for the animated feature, a film that remains one of Driscoll's best-remembered projects. As the studio could find no suitable live-action film for Driscoll, Larry Watkin soon focused on another UK project, a retelling of the Robin Hood legend. This project would proceed in the exact same fashion as Treasure Island. A script about Robin Hood would be developed in California and then filmed overseas. Watkin could see that the studio was slowly creating a set of films that, along with the true-life adventures, would change the identity of the Disney studio in the 1950s, moving it away from an organization primarily focused on animation and hopefully toward something more. I'll be back next week to continue our story on Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and how the UK production team moved the Disney studio toward live action in the 1950s. If you've never seen Treasure Island, or if it's been a while, you can find the film on Disney+. I have a feeling that you'll notice some new things now that we've talked about it on the podcast. If you're watching it with your kids, there are some scenes of violence, but I'd say it's relatively mild, and I'd personally say that it's fine if your kids are in 3rd grade or up. If you watch the film, drop me a note. Let me know what you think of it. You can contact me easily through my website, which is toddjamespierce.com. Also, if you're interested in the Disney studio during this period, over on Bandcamp you'll find a 4-part series that covers many of these same years, called Ken Anderson and the Origins of Audio Animatronics. Walt had different working groups in the studio. In the early 1950s, Larry Watkin and Percy Pierce formed a working group that moved Disney into live-action features. But there was another working group during these same years where Walt experimented with very early animatronics. That group had Ken Anderson, Harper Goff, and others. It's a good companion piece as together, these two series depict how Walt, in multiple areas at the studio, begins to expand his company beyond animation. Again, the series is over on Bandcamp. It's called Ken Anderson and the Origins of Audio Animatronics. It has 4 parts and runs about 2 hours. Lastly, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.